So I'm putting the information I have available on my timeline. I'm going to show you that what I do on this timeline is exactly what happens in the analysis of equity. Remember, the timeline's purpose is to identify, first of all, the equity movements in the subsidiary that's allowed to be in the group. Then, of those amounts, we attribute each time to the equity participants. But if you remember back to the videos we did on the introduction to Chapter 8, the analysis of equity and the timeline starts being a lot more involved the moment you have your preference shares as well, because your preference shareholders are now also equity participants in this same equity of the subsidiary. Now, the share capital, if you remember correctly, the ordinary share capital is only attributable to the ordinary shares, and the preference share capital is only attributable to the preference shares. So that will end up in their separate analyses. That will eliminate in each of the separate at acquisition consolidation journal entries. So the real equity item that we have to focus on is the retained earnings of the subsidiary. And the reason why we focus on the retained earnings is your dividend that you will declare to the preference shareholders is declared out of retained earnings. So that would be the equity item of the subsidiary that's also attributable, or a portion thereof is also attributable to your preference shareholders. Now we will follow exactly the same thought process. We identify the at acquisition equity of the subsidiary, and as I've said, we're going to focus on retained earnings for now. At acquisition date, they told you in the additional information that the retained earnings was 7,500 Rand. Then you identify the opening retained earnings, and this amount of 117,500 comes from the given trial balance. Then what we have to do is we need to identify the movement between these two amounts, because only the movement is allowed to be in the group, and of that movement we now need to determine how much is attributable to the preference shareholders and how much is attributable to the ordinary shareholders. Again, why am I using the movement? I have this 117,500 in the TB, but this 7,500 is included in that cumulative balance, but this gets eliminated. That's why I am only allowed to attribute that movement to my equity participants. Right, so the movement between the TB balance and the at acquisition retained earnings can be calculated as 110,000 Rand, which is just the difference between the two amounts. Now, when we're working with Chapter 8, the first question you have to ask is, that 110,000 Rand movement, who is that attributable to? Because the moment you have preference shareholders in the subsidiary as well, this is potentially no longer only attributable to the ordinary shareholders. Now, your decision depends on what's happened with the annual fixed preference dividend. This example looks at cumulative preference shares, and for cumulative preference shares, the shareholders are firstly entitled to an annual dividend, but on top of that, you also need to understand whether that fixed annual dividend was declared or not, as that will also influence your answer to the first question, who is this attributable to? Now, to help you understand that, I'm going to give you a breakdown of this TB balance. But what I want you to do in the meantime is answer for yourself. Who do you think that 110,000 Rand is attributable to? Is that now to the ordinary shareholders and the preference shareholders, or perhaps still only to the ordinary shareholders? And before we look at the breakdown of that TB balance, what would be the amount attributable to the preference shareholders? That would be their fixed annual dividend per year. But let's have a look. This DB balance, remember when I looked at the given information, this represents the X9 reporting period, and this is X10. So there's only 1 year since acquisition date when I'm talking about the opening retained earnings. So my opening balance would be the 7,500. We know that there was only a preference dividend declared in 20X9. The information told us that. So that means that my profit amount for the year would be 120,000. So that would be the amounts making up that 117,500. The opening balance of 7,500 plus a profit of 120,000, and from that a preference dividend was deducted of 10,000 Rand. So now I ask the same question. This movement of 110,000 Rand, who is that attributable to? Do I need to exclude a further 10,000 Rand from the 110,000 Rand and say that is attributable to the ordinary shareholders? Or is the full 110,000 Rand perhaps already attributable only to the ordinary shareholders? Your answer comes from this breakdown. How did you get to the 117,500? You have already deducted the 10,000 Rand attributable to the preference shareholders. So this amount of 110,000 Rand is only attributable to the ordinary shareholders. So if that amount now gets attributed to the ordinary shareholders, how would I do that? That is attributable to PNCI, and that would be in their percentage holding as ordinary shareholders, 70%, 30%, and this would give me an amount of 33,000 Rand, for which I need a consolidation journal entry to change the balance of non-controlling interests. So this timeline and the discussion so far has helped me to identify the amount for which I need a consolidation journal entry for the since to opening balance period to measure and change my NCI balance. By doing this, I have attributed the full 110,000 Rand movement only to the ordinary shareholders. So we need to unpack this a little bit further, because the question we now have to ask is, what about this fixed annual dividend of 10,000 Rand that these preference shareholders are entitled to? They are cumulative and they are entitled to that. Why are we not attributing a portion of that 10,000 Rand to NCI preference shares? Why are we not writing a consolidation journal entry to change their balance? And your answer to that lies in the concept I've introduced when I started talking about example 8.1. You only write consolidation journal entries for NCI if their balance must change. What happened in X9 with regards to my non-controlling interest preference shares and parent as an equity participant preference shares? So in the X9 reporting period, what would you have done to your non-controlling interest and parent as preference shareholders with regards to the 10,000 Rand? First of all, this 10,000 Rand, if you attribute that to the parent and NCI in terms of their percentage holding as preference shareholders, this is 40%, and that would be 60%, and this gives you an amount of 6,000 Rand. Do you agree? That is the portion of the 10,000 Rand that's attributable to NCI preference shares. But then in X9, what would you have done? Remember my step 1 and step 2. You would have attributed that 6,000 Rand to NCI by saying debit the retained earnings opening balance of S, credit NCI with their portion they are entitled to. That is step 1. Increase their balance. But because you also declared that dividend in X9, the second journal also happened where we said debit NCI, credit dividend declared by S for the 6,000 Rand. So what happened to the NCI balance with regards to the preference share NCI in X9? We increased their balance with 6,000, where we attributed what they are entitled to as cumulative preference shareholders, but because the dividend was also declared, the second step was to account for that dividend declared with this debit to their balance that will reduce it again. So what you've attributed and what they've received back was the same amount. So their balance for NCI preference shares did not change in the X9 or the since to opening balance period. And as a result, there's no further consolidation journal entry necessary to change your NCI since to opening balance. For all consolidation journal entries, you have to ask whether that journal changed a balance, because if it changed a balance in a particular reporting period, you need to repeat the effect thereof. So for these two journal entries at the bottom, we are confident that the NCI balance didn't change, so there's no need to repeat the journal. But what about the other two legs? Your answer is in this, that this debit changes retained earnings, and because dividends declared also closes off to retained earnings, this debit and this credit also has a zero effect on the retained earnings of the group. So as a result, we can conclude that these two journal entries definitely do not have to be repeated in a following reporting period.